January 23, 1942, Saiprishu 17 a.m. Major General Theodor Scherer stood in his command bunker in the small Russian town of Kholm, staring at the map before him. Through the frozen window, he could see the first tracer rounds of Soviet artillery, painting the morning sky in an eerie orange glow. His radio operator, Lance Corporal John Miller from Dresden, turned to him, his face pale. The message had arrived. The Soviet Third Shock Army had cut off all lines of communication. 5,500 German soldiers, his men, were now completely encircled. No reinforcements, no supply routes, only the icy Russian steppe surrounding them, and a hostile army 10 times their size. In that moment, Scherer knew the next few weeks would either make history or wipe out his entire battle group. What he couldn't know then was that it wouldn't be weeks. It would be 105 days. 105 days that would redefine the limits of human endurance. The winter of 1941-42 was one of the hardest Russia had ever seen. Temperatures regularly plummeted to -31 degrees Fahrenheit. The German Operation Barbarossa, which had begun with such confidence in June 1941, had ground to a halt in the Russian winter. Moscow had not fallen. Leningrad still stood. And now, in January 1942, the Soviets launched their major counteroffensive along the entire front. Colonel General Semyon Timoshenko had an ambitious plan: to shatter the German Army Group North, liberate Leningrad, and throw the German troops back to the Baltic coast. To achieve this, key German strongholds had to be eliminated. One of these strongholds was Kholm, a small town with strategic importance on the railway line to Staraya Russa, and in Kholm stood Kampfgruppe Scherer, Battle Group Scherer. Major General Theodor Scherer was 47 years old, a career soldier of the old school. Born in Stuttgart, he had already served in World War I and received the Iron Cross. He was known for his composure under pressure, his care for his men, and his tactical brilliance. His battle group consisted of remnants of the 281st Security Division, reinforced by various units that had retreated to Kholm, a total of 5,500 men. Among them were infantrymen, artillerymen, pioneers, signals troops, medics, and even some anti-aircraft guns. It wasn't an elite division. These were ordinary soldiers, men like Senior Lance Corporal Friedrich Weber from Munich, who had been a carpenter before the war, or Corporal Charles Taylor from Hamburg, a former teacher, or 19-year-old gunner Anthony Fischer from a small village in Bavaria, who still dreamed of Christmas with his family in his letters home. These men had no idea that they were about to make history. The Soviet leadership saw Kholm as easy prey. Lieutenant General Ivan Kuznetsov, commander of the units surrounding Kholm, sent a message to his headquarters on January 24th. German sources later documented its content. The enemy is encircled. Estimated strength, 3,000 men. Poorly supplied, demoralized. Expected surrender within 48 hours. Kuznetsov had approximately 40,000 soldiers at his disposal, with tank support and abundant artillery. The math seemed clear. 40,000 against 5,500, 8-1. In the Soviet Stavka, the high command, Kholm was already considered captured. They were already planning the next operations. But Kuznetsov and his superiors had made a fatal mistake. They didn't know Theodor Scherer, and they didn't know the men he commanded. On the morning of January 25, 1942, the first major Soviet assault began. At 0630 hours, Soviet artillery batteries opened fire on the German positions. Hundreds of shells rained down on the town. Buildings exploded. Streets turned into cratered landscapes. In the basement of a destroyed house, medics huddled around wounded soldiers. Senior physician Dr. Heinrich Bauer, a surgeon from Berlin, operated by candlelight, while the walls above him shook. Then, at 07:45 hours, the infantry came. Soviet soldiers in white winter uniforms stormed out of the forest towards the German lines. The German MG-42 gunners dug into the frozen earth, opened fire. The characteristic rat-tat-tat of the German machine guns, 200 rounds per minute, filled the icy air. Gunner Hans Keller from Berlin, an MG gunner in the 3rd Company, would later report, "I saw them coming, wave after wave. We fired until the barrels glowed. They fell, but more and more kept coming. I thought it would never end." The attack lasted 6 hours. 6 times the Soviets tried to break through the German lines. 6 times they were repulsed. When silence finally fell at 14 hours, hundreds of Soviet dead lay in the snow before the German positions. The Germans had lost 73 men, 41 dead, 32 wounded, but they had held. In his bunker, Scherer wrote in his war diary, January 25th, first Soviet attack repelled, ammunition consumption critical, losses tolerable but not sustainable, rations for an estimated 12 days. Without air supply, we will not hold out for more than 2 weeks. He put down his pen and looked at his officers. No one spoke what they were all thinking. They were alone. The next German lines were 25 miles away. Between them and salvation stood 40,000 enemy soldiers. That evening, Scherer gathered his company commanders. Captain Werner Vogel, commander of the 2nd Company, a seasoned officer from the Sudetenland. First Lieutenant Joseph King, a pioneer officer from Austria. Captain Frederick Braun, an artillery commander. Scherer spoke calmly, but his words carried weight. "Gentlemen, no one is coming to save us. Not tomorrow, not next week, maybe never. But I do not intend to surrender. Kholm is our position, and we will hold it. Not for Hitler, not for ideology, for the men next to us, for our comrades. We hold or we die together, but we will not surrender." The officers nodded. There was no discussion. They all knew. Surrender in Russia often meant death in Siberian camps. Resistance might also mean death, but at least fighting, with dignity. The Luftwaffe attempted to supply the encircled soldiers. Junkers, Ju-52 transport aircraft, the robust workhorses of the German Air Force, were supposed to drop supplies over Kholm, but the area was small, only about 1.5 square miles, and there was no suitable runway. Everything had to be dropped. The first attempts were catastrophic. On the 26th, in January, 3 Junkers Ju-52s dropped supply containers. 2 landed in Soviet territory. 1 landed in a burning house and was destroyed. The soldiers starved as they watched their supplies go up in flames. Lance Corporal Otto Schmidt from Cologne wrote in his diary, "We saw the plane, we saw the containers falling, but we couldn't reach them. The Russians were shooting at everything that moved. We had to watch our hope turn to ashes." The Captain John George von Tempelhof, a transport pilot for the Luftwaffe, stationed in Pskov, 110 miles from Kholm, received orders to improve the supply situation. Von Tempelhof was 34 years old, an experienced pilot from Berlin. He worked closely with Scherer, coordinating over radio communications. They developed a system. The Germans marked secure drop zones with colored smoke grenades. The Ju-52s flew at low altitude, often just 150 feet above the ground, to drop supplies more accurately. This made them perfect targets for Soviet anti-aircraft fire. On January 29th, the first Ju-52 was shot down over Kholm. All 4 crew members died. On February 2nd, a second. On February 7th, a third. The transport pilots knew that every flight to Kholm could be a death sentence, but they kept flying. Every day. Von Tempelhof would later say, "We knew there were 5,500 men down there who were counting on us. How could we stop?" The Soviet attacks came in waves. On February 1st, the second major assault. On February 4th, the third. On February 7th, 10th and 13th, more followed. The Germans developed a routine of survival. During the day, repel attacks, tend to the wounded, repair positions. At night, sort ammunition, thaw frozen weapons, bury the dead. Which was almost impossible because the ground was frozen solid. The corpses piled up in an abandoned warehouse. Private Anthony Fischer, the 19-year-old from Bavaria, was assigned to register the dead. He recognized faces, men he had played cards with just days before. In a letter he wrote but could never send, he said, "Mother, today I laid my best friend on the pile of bodies. He was 20. We had promised to go to Munich together after the war. Now he's frozen stiff, and I can't even dig a grave." The food situation became desperate. The original supplies ran out by early February. The air supply delivered an average of 25 tons per day. The battle group needed 50 tons. Soldiers ate horse meat from fallen animals. They boiled leather belts for soup. They ate snow for water, which led to frostbite in their mouths. The daily ration dropped to 5 ounces of bread and a thin soup. Men lost weight rapidly. Corporal Frederick Weber, the carpenter from Munich, lost 40 pounds in 4 weeks. His uniform hung on him like on a skeleton. But even worse than the hunger was the cold. February 1942 was relentlessly cold. Nighttime temperatures reached -44 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers in outposts had to be rotated every 30 minutes or they would freeze. Despite thick winter clothing, despite everything they tried, fingers, toes, ears, noses froze. Dr. Bauer, the surgeon, amputated daily. First individual fingers, then whole hands, then feet. His medical log documents, February 12th, 7 amputations, including 3 of both feet, anesthesia used up, morphine critically low. Many patients will die, not from wounds, but from infections I can't treat. Yet Dr. Bauer did not give up. He worked 18-hour shifts. His medics, exhausted and malnourished, helped him. Senior medic Ludwig Stein from Frankfurt would later receive the Knight's Cross for his service. He had rescued 47 wounded men under fire, carrying 3 of them on his back through snow and enemy fire. But what shocked the Soviet leadership most was not the physical resilience of the Germans. It was the mental resilience. Lieutenant General Kuznetsov had expected the Germans to be demoralized and surrender after 2 weeks. Instead, they became tougher. A Soviet war diary, later captured, contains an entry from February 15th. German morale inexplicably high. Prisoners report hunger and cold, but also unbreaking will. Their commander Scherer seems to inspire them. Recommend psychological warfare. And so the Soviets began using loudspeakers. At night, over the frozen steppe, voices boomed in perfect German. "German soldiers, why are you dying for nothing? Your homeland is thousands of miles away. Your comrades have forgotten you. Surrender and you will be treated humanely. Warm food, medical care, survival. The alternative is death in the cold." The first night the loudspeakers blared, there was silence in the German positions. Would someone defect? Scherer waited. Then, from one of the positions, someone began to sing. It was Senior Lance Corporal Weber, the carpenter. He sang an old German folk song. A second soldier joined in, then a third. Within minutes, hundreds of German soldiers were singing, their voices carried across the battlefield. The Soviet loudspeakers fell silent. Not a single German soldier defected that night, or on any other night during the entire 105 days. 0 defectors. That was unprecedented. Kuznetsov sent a report to the High Command. Germans show fanatical loyalty to their commander. Psychological measures ineffective. Recommend increased military force. The Soviet attacks intensified. In mid-February, tank attacks began. Old T-26 tanks and modern T-34s rolled towards the German lines. The Germans had limited anti-tank weapons, some 3.7 paquet guns, which were almost ineffective against T-34 armor, but they had German ingenuity and desperation. Lieutenant King, the engineer officer, developed improvised tactics. His engineers dug tank traps. They laid anti-tank mines in snowdrifts. They fashioned Molotov cocktails from captured Soviet gasoline canisters. On February 18th, a column of 8 T-34 tanks attacked the southern position. 2 drove onto mines and were immobilized. A third was hit by one of the few German paquet guns, not destroyed but damaged. The remaining 5 broke through the first line. Then something happened that Soviet commanders did not expect. German engineers, led by Corporal Paul Richter from Leipzig, ran from their cover directly toward the tanks. They carried bundles of stick grenades. Bound together into improvised charges, John Miller leaped onto the first T-34, ripped open the hatch and threw the grenades inside. The tank exploded from within. His 2 comrades, Lance Corporal Heinz Becker and Private Ludwig Kramer, attacked a second tank. Becker was hit by a machine gun and died instantly. Kramer, alone, placed his charge on the tracks. The tank was immobilized, the crew evacuated, and were cut down by German MG-42 fire. Of 8 tanks, 3 returned. 5 remained as burning wrecks. Paul Richter survived with burns on both hands. He received the German Cross in gold in his injury report. Senior physician Bauer wrote, "Richter has second-degree burns on both hands. Despite the pain, he refuses evacuation, says his men need him. Such men cannot be defeated." By the end of February, the Germans had destroyed 42 Soviet tanks, not through superior weapons, but through courage, bordering on insanity. And the Soviets began to understand. Kholm would not fall easily. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, one of the most brilliant Soviet commanders, visited Kuznetsov's headquarters on February 24th. According to later reports, he asked, "A small town, 5,000 soldiers, besieged for a month. Why does it still stand?" Kuznetsov had no good answer. Timoshenko reportedly said, "Because their commander is better than yours. Learn from him or replace him." Kuznetsov was not replaced. But the Soviet tactics changed. More artillery, more attacks, more pressure. March 1942 brought even harder fighting. The Soviets launched coordinated attacks with artillery preparation, tank support, and infantry waves. On March 3rd, an attack began that lasted 36 hours. Continuously, without pause, German soldiers fought until they collapsed from exhaustion, were replaced by comrades, slept 2 hours, and returned to the front. Ammunition became so scarce that Scherer personally rationed every shell. MG-42 gunners received orders: only fire when the enemy is closer than 50 meters, no warning shots. Every bullet must count. Private John Keller, the MG-42 gunner from Berlin, counted his remaining rounds, 230 shots. Before him, an estimated 400 Soviet soldiers charged. He would later say, "I didn't pray for salvation. I prayed for enough ammunition." But then something happened that the Soviets hadn't planned for. German soldiers began using Soviet weapons. Fallen Red Army soldiers had left behind rifles, ammunition, grenades. The Germans collected everything: PPS-41 submachine guns, Mosin Nagant rifles, DP-27 machine guns. Corporal Charles Taylor, the former teacher from Hamburg, became an improvised weapons master. He taught soldiers how to operate Soviet weapons. Soon German soldiers were fighting with a mix of German and Soviet weapons. This confused the attacking Soviets. They heard their own weapons and no longer knew who was friend or foe. A Soviet report from March 9th complained, "Germans are using our own weapons against us." This complicates identification and lowers the morale of our troops. By mid-March, half of the German garrison was dead, wounded, or incapacitated. Of 5,500 men, only about 2,800 were still fit for duty. Every single one was malnourished, hypothermic, exhausted, but they continued to fight. Why? Historians have debated this question for decades. Some said ideology, others said fear of capture, but the soldiers themselves gave a simpler answer. Senior Lance Corporal Frederick Weber wrote in his diary on March 14th, "I don't fight for politics. I fight for Charles next to me, who pulled me out of the fire yesterday. I fight for 19-year-old Anthony, who shared his ration with me, even though he himself is starving. I fight because Scherer visits the positions every morning, is wounded, but doesn't give up. How can I surrender when he doesn't surrender?" Camaraderie. That was the secret. Not ideology. Human connection under impossible circumstances. On March 21st, young Anthony Fischer died. The 19-year-old from Bavaria, who had dreamed of Munich, was hit by a Soviet sniper. The bullet pierced his lung. He died in the arms of senior physician Bauer, who could do nothing more. His last words, documented by a medic. "Did we hold? Tell me that we held." Senior physician Bauer, with tears in his eyes, replied, "Yes, Anthony, we held." Fischer smiled and died. He became the 1,147th German soldier to fall in Kholm, but the town still stood. Senior Lance Corporal Weber, who had treated Anthony like a little brother, wrote his parents a letter that he could never send. He kept it in his pocket in case he survived. The letter ended, "Your son died a hero, not because he died for ideals, but because he died for us, for his comrades. There is no greater love." By the end of March, the battle for Kholm reached international attention. German propaganda used it as an example of heroism. Soviet propaganda largely concealed it, a failure that could not be explained. But in the trenches on both sides, something unexpected developed: respect. Soviet soldiers, who had fought against Kampfgruppe Scherer, began to speak differently about the Germans. A Soviet soldier, later taken prisoner, said, "We hated them because they were invaders, but we respected them because they never gave up, even when we were 10-1, even when they were starving. They kept fighting. That's not normal. That's something else." In early April, the Soviets launched a massive offensive to finally eliminate Kholm. Lieutenant General Kuznetsov had reinforced. Now 60,000 Soviet soldiers were concentrated around the town. Artillery support had been massively increased. On April 3rd, the largest bombardment that Kholm had ever experienced began. Thousands of shells in 6 hours. The town was literally leveled to the ground. No building remained intact. German soldiers survived only because they lay deep in cellars and bunkers. When the bombardment ended, the infantry came, and the tanks. This time, 18 T-34s in the first wave alone. Scherer had about 2,400 combat-ready men left, ammunition for less than a day of intense fighting, almost no anti-tank defenses left. It looked like the end. But then the Luftwaffe intervened. Stukas, Junkers Ju-87 dive bombers, flew from German airfields in Pskov directly to Kholm. Under the command of Major Paul Werner Hosel, they attacked Soviet tank columns. The Stuka's characteristic sirens, the Jericho trumpets, filled the sky. Bombs rained down. Tanks exploded. The Soviet infantry, lacking tank support, were mowed down by German MG-42 gunners. The attack collapsed. On that day, the Soviets lost 11 tanks and an estimated 800 men. The Germans lost 94 soldiers, but they held. Scherer sent a radio message to the Air Force Command. "Without your help, we would be history. Thank you is not enough. You saved our lives." Major Hosel simply replied, "Hold on, we're coming back." By mid-April, it was clear that the Soviets could not capture Kholm. Too many losses, too little success. But at the same time, it was equally clear that the Germans could not hold out forever. It was a stalemate. But then, the strategic situation changed. The German Wehrmacht launched a relief operation. Battle groups from outside began to slowly fight their way toward Kholm, kilometer by kilometer, village by village, under heavy Soviet resistance. But they were coming. On April 20th, the relief troops were 15 kilometers from Kholm. On April 25th, 8 kilometers. On May 1st, 3 kilometers. The men in Kholm could hear the distant artillery fire. Rescue was near. But would they hold out long enough? By May 3rd, 1942, only 1,250 German soldiers in Kholm were still fit for combat. Nearly 4,000 were dead, wounded, or so sick that they could not fight. Ammunition was sufficient for perhaps 2 hours of combat. Provisions were practically non-existent. Men ate anything they could find, and yet they fought. On the morning of May 5th, they heard something new. German artillery fire, not distant, near, very near. Then, a radio message. "This is Battle Group Seydlitz. We are 1 kilometer south of your position. Hold on. We're coming." Scherer, who had barely slept for weeks, his face etched with exhaustion, smiled for the first time in months. He ordered his men, "Prepare to break out. We're going to meet them." At 2:37 p.m. on May 5th, 1942, after exactly 105 days of siege, the first connection was made. German tanks from the relief force met German infantry from Kholm in a small wooded area south of the town. Soldiers embraced. Men wept. Corporal Charles Taylor, the teacher, collapsed and cried uncontrollably. Senior Lance Corporal Frederick Weber fell to his knees in the snow. Scherer stood there, looked at his men, looked at the relief troops, and simply said, "We held." The siege of Kholm was over. Of the 5,500 soldiers who were encircled on January 23rd, 1,250 survived fit for combat and approximately 2,200 wounded. Nearly 1,800 were dead. The Soviets had suffered an estimated 20,000 to 25,000 casualties in the fighting for a small town. The story of Battle Group Scherer spread quickly through the Wehrmacht. Adolf Hitler personally awarded Theodor Scherer the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves on June 1st, 1942. It was Scherer who suggested creating a special badge for the defenders. The Kholm Shield was created, a special award, bestowed only on soldiers who had endured the 105 days. It depicted an Edelweiss, the symbol of the mountain troops, and the date, January 21st, May 5th, 1942, every survivor received it. Senior Lance Corporal Frederick Weber wore his until his death in 1973. At his funeral, it was placed in his coffin, but there were also voices of criticism. Some military historians asked, was it worth it? 1,800 dead soldiers for a small town with limited strategic importance. Could they not have broken out? Should they have surrendered to save lives? These questions are legitimate, but they ignore the context. A breakout through 40,000 enemy soldiers would have been a suicide mission. Surrender would likely have meant that most soldiers would have died in Soviet captivity. Statistics show that over 50% of German prisoners of war died in Soviet camps, especially in the harsh years of 1941-1942. And strategically, Kholm tied up 40,000 Soviet soldiers for over 3 months. That was 40,000 soldiers who could not be deployed elsewhere. The Wehrmacht leadership calculated 5,500 men tie up 40,000 enemy troops. That's a strategic gain, even if it sounds cynical. The Soviet leadership drew their own lessons. Marshal Zhukov wrote in his memoirs, published in 1969, "Kholm taught us that well-led, motivated defenders are almost impossible to defeat. Even with numerical superiority, we lost more men trying to capture a town than the Germans had defending it. That is unacceptable." In subsequent Soviet operations, tactics changed. Encircled German positions were often bypassed instead of being attacked head-on. Kholm had proven, sometimes, bypassing is smarter than confrontation. For the German soldiers who survived, Kholm was a formative experience. Dr. Henry Bauer, the surgeon, returned to Berlin after the war. He never worked as a surgeon again. The memories were too traumatic. But he wrote his memoirs, published in 1961. One quote, "In Kholm I saw the best and the worst of humanity. The worst, war, death, senseless suffering. The best, people who gave everything for each other. Medics who ran under fire to save the wounded. Soldiers who shared their rations even though they themselves were starving. A commander who never gave up and inspired his men. If humanity could use this self-sacrifice for peaceful purposes, there would be no limits to what we could achieve." Corporal Charles Taylor, the teacher, returned to Hamburg and became a teacher again. He never spoke about Kholm until 1978, when a historian interviewed him. Taylor, now 67 years old, said, "Why haven't I talked about it? Because words can't describe it. How do I explain to my students that I saw men turn into skeletons but kept fighting? How do I explain that for 105 days I thought every day would be my last? How do I explain the camaraderie that was stronger than the fear of death? I can't, so I remain silent, but I remember every day." Senior Lance Corporal Frederick Weber, the carpenter from Munich, survived the war and returned to his trade. He built furniture, got married, had 3 children, but every year on May 5th, the day the siege ended, he went to a church alone. He lit candles, one for each of the fated 800 men who had fallen in Kholm. That was too many candles for one person, so he symbolically lit 18. His wife, Mary, asked him once why he did that. Weber responded, "Because they died for me." Anthony Fisher, the 19-year-old, shared his ration with me, even though he was starving. He died. I lived. Paul Richter jumped on a tank so that we could survive. He was wounded. I remained unharmed. How can I forget them? How can I not give thanks every single day? The memory of Kholm lives on. In Germany, there are small memorials. In Russia, where the town is now called Kholm, there are both Soviet and German memorial plaques, a rare example of mutual remembrance. In 2012, for the 70th anniversary, the last survivors met, 4 German veterans and 6 Soviet veterans. They were all over 85 years old. They embraced. A Soviet veteran, Ivan Petrov, 89 years old, said through a translator, "We were enemies. We tried to kill you. You tried to kill us. That was war. But today, we are old men, and war is over. I respect your courage. You fought as we later fought in Stalingrad. Until the end. That deserves respect." A German veteran, Helmut Braun, 87, replied, "And we respect your courage. You came again and again, despite our fire." That requires bravery that I will never forget. Military academies around the world still study Kholm today. The U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth has a case study about the siege. It's used to teach officers principles of defense under difficult conditions. Key lessons. First, leadership is crucial. Scherer's leadership, personal, visible, inspiring, kept morale up when everything else was collapsing. Second, logistics is life. The air supply, as inadequate as it was, kept the garrison alive. Without it, Kholm would have fallen in a week. Third, camaraderie trumps ideology. The soldiers weren't fighting for propaganda. They were fighting for each other. That lesson is timeless. But perhaps the most important lesson from Kholm is human, not military. People are capable of extraordinary things when they have a reason to endure. The men of Kampfgruppe Scherer had no easy way out. Surrender likely meant death in captivity. A breakout likely meant death in combat. So they fought, day after day, hour after hour. They starved, froze, suffered, and died. But they stuck together. And in the end, against all odds, they held out. That is the story of Kholm, not a story of ideology or politics. A story of human endurance, of camaraderie, of men who refused to give up, because giving up would have betrayed their comrades. Theodor Scherer himself survived the war. He was later promoted to lieutenant general and commanded various units. After the war, he was briefly interned, then released. He retired from public life and lived quietly in southern Germany. He died in 1976 at the age of 81. At his funeral, over 200 veterans showed up, men who had fought in Kholm. They stood in rows, old men with tears in their eyes, and saluted as his coffin was carried past. One of them, a former lance corporal named William Cook, told a reporter, "He led us through hell, but he also led us out. There are no words for what he meant to us. He wasn't just our commander, he was our father, our brother, our hope. Without him, we all would have died in Kholm." The numbers from Kholm are impressive. 105 days of siege, 5,500 German soldiers against 40,000 to 60,000 Soviet troops, 100 documented Soviet major assaults repelled, 42 enemy tanks destroyed, 20,000 to 25,000 Soviet casualties, 1,800 German dead, 2,200 wounded, 1,550 survivors fit for combat. But numbers don't tell the whole story. The whole story is in the names. Anthony Fischer, 19, from Bavaria, dreamed of Munich. Paul Richter, who jumped on a tank. Dr. Henry Bauer, who saved hundreds. Corporal Charles Taylor, the teacher, who repurposed Soviet weapons. Senior Lance Corporal Frederick Weber, the carpenter, who lit candles for the fallen. Captain von Tempelhof, the pilot, who kept flying despite losses. And Major General Theodor Scherer, the man who never gave up and inspired thousands by doing so. Today, more than 80 years later, Kholm is a quiet Russian small town. The war is long over, but the memory remains. There's a small museum with artifacts from the battle. Old helmets, weapons, photographs, letters that were never sent. Visitors from Germany and Russia come to commemorate. Both sides respect what happened there, because Kholm wasn't just a German or Soviet story, it was a human story. A story of people fighting under impossible circumstances. Some for a Germany they barely knew, others for a Soviet Union they were defending, all for the people next to them, for their comrades, for the hope that if they just held on one more day, maybe, just maybe, salvation would come. And salvation did come on May 5th, 1942, after 105 days. The longest 105 days in those men's lives, days that for many were also their last, but days that wrote history, days that proved that the human spirit, when it has a reason to fight, is invincible. That is the legacy of Kampfgruppe Scherer. That is the legacy of Kholm, not war, not ideology, but human endurance against impossible odds, camaraderie that defied death, leadership that inspired, and men who refused to surrender. Because surrender would have meant betraying the people they were fighting for, the men next to them in the frozen trenches of a small Russian town that the world called Kholm. These aren't just statistics from dusty archives. These are the moments that decided the fate of thousands, real soldiers, real fear, real camaraderie, real consequences. These stories must never be forgotten. If these historical truths are important to you, Then support me with YouTube's Super Thanks, the golden heart below. Every Super Thanks enables me to spend weeks in archives, digitizing rare documents, interviewing the last eyewitnesses. Help me preserve this history for future generations. What impressed you most about the story of Kampfgruppe Scherer? Many viewers have shared incredible family stories, grandfathers who were there, letters found in attics, war diaries that lasted generations. Share your family stories from this era in the comments below. Every single comment is a piece of history that we can preserve together. Let's hear those tales of resilience and remembrance. Your ancestors' experiences deserve to be remembered and honored. Don't let these stories fade away. Share what you know. Contribute to our collective memory. By leaving your thoughts and family recollections below, you become a part of something much bigger, a living archive of human endurance and the struggles faced during that harrowing period. What did your grandparents or great-grandparents tell you about Kholm, about the Eastern Front, about the war's impact on their lives? Every anecdote, every detail adds another layer to our understanding of this historical event and helps future generations grasp the full significance of what happened at Kholm. So please, take a moment to share your story.